Lock the players out. Lock them out. Put some real pressure on them. Send them an email. Hey, if our proposal doesn't get finished by this date, from every day there on after, the offer will get considerably worse. This is our...
March 10 isn't just another date on the calendar. It could be the moment the entire future of the WNBA shifts overnight. Behind closed doors, league owners and the Players Association are locked in a financial standoff that's turning more intense by the day. What started as bold demands fueled by record-breaking ratings and explosive growth has now morphed into a pressure cooker with real consequences. The players believe this is their once-in-a-generation chance to claim a bigger piece of a rapidly expanding pie. Ownership, on the other hand, insists the math simply doesn't support the demands being made, and if neither side blinks, the season itself could hang in the balance. But here, where it gets even more dramatic, there's growing talk of a tactic that could flip the entire negotiation on its head, an offer that doesn't just expire, it gets worse every single day it's ignored. And if that happens, everything changes. Everything changed the moment the ratings exploded. When Caitlin Clark entered the league, it wasn't just another rookie storyline. Arenas started selling out, television numbers surged, social media engagement went through the roof. For the first time in years, the WNBA felt less like a slow-building project and more like a full-blown cultural wave. And the players noticed. For decades, ownership groups leaned on one consistent message: the league wasn't profitable, growth was steady but fragile, big raises simply weren't realistic. But suddenly, franchise valuations reportedly skyrocketed, media rights deals jumped into the billions, corporate sponsors lined up. The entire financial narrative flipped almost overnight. So the union made its move. They demanded 27.5% of the league's gross revenue, not net, not after expenses, but straight from the top line. It was aggressive, it was bold, and it signaled something deeper than money. It signaled that the players believed the power dynamic had shifted. From their perspective, this wasn't greed, it was timing. If there was ever a moment to push, this was it. The league had momentum. Owners had leverage before, now the players felt like they did. They saw packed buildings in Indiana. They saw national broadcasts drawing numbers that hadn't been touched in years. They saw jersey sales flying off shelves, and they thought, this is the window. But here, where it gets complicated. Critics argue that one star-driven surge doesn't automatically guarantee long-term profitability. They say one blockbuster rookie class doesn't instantly transform the underlying economics of every franchise. Some teams still play in smaller venues. Some markets still struggle with attendance. The revenue spike, while dramatic, may not yet be evenly distributed. Still, from the union's standpoint, waiting felt dangerous. Athletic careers are short. Prime years disappear quickly. The veteran leadership likely understood that by the time long-term stability is proven, many of them won't be around to benefit. So they swung big, knowing full well it would shock ownership. And shock it did. Owners reportedly viewed the 27.5% demand as detached from financial reality, especially when compared to their reported willingness to offer around 15%. That gap wasn't small, it wasn't incremental, it was massive. But the union wasn't trying to meet in the middle right away. They were anchoring the negotiation, starting high, establishing a new baseline. Whether that was strategic brilliance or a dangerous overplay is still up for debate. Because once you make a demand that bold, you can't easily walk it back without losing credibility. And that's exactly where the next twist in this battle begins. Then came the moment that was supposed to calm everything down. After weeks of public pressure and growing whispers about a potential lockout, the union signaled it was ready to compromise. Headlines framed it as a breakthrough. Reports suggested leadership was making meaningful adjustments to save the season. On the surface, it looked like progress. But when the numbers actually surfaced, the reaction inside ownership circles was the opposite of relief. The revenue demand didn't drop from 27.5% to something close to the league's reported 15% position. It didn't even fall near 20%. Instead, it slid to 26%. A 1.5% shift. That was the concession. From the union's perspective, this was a signal of flexibility. They could argue they moved first. They blinked. They showed willingness to negotiate. In labor disputes, even small steps can sometimes unlock larger discussions. But ownership reportedly saw it differently. To them, trimming 1.5% off a demand that was already miles apart from their offer wasn't a compromise. It felt symbolic, almost cosmetic. If the gap is massive, shaving a fraction off the top doesn't close it. It highlights how far apart both sides still are. And that's where the credibility issue began to creep in. In any negotiation, a counteroffer is meant to bridge distance. It's supposed to narrow the range enough to create momentum. Instead, this move arguably reinforced how entrenched the union remained. Critics began describing it as an anchor strategy gone too far, a high starting point that became difficult to retreat from without appearing weak. But there's another layer here. Union leadership may have been caught between two pressures. On one side, ownership demanding financial restraint. On the other, rank-and-file players expecting bold action during what feels like a historic growth moment. Dropping too far, too fast, could have sparked internal backlash. Standing firm risked escalation. So they chose the middle path, technically adjusting, but not fundamentally shifting. And that's when the temperature really rose. Because when a concession doesn't feel like one, it doesn't ease tension, it increases it. Owners may now believe the union is posturing rather than negotiating. Meanwhile, players may feel they've already shown goodwill and expect movement in return. That stalemate is dangerous. Once both sides start interpreting each other's moves as bad faith, logic alone won't fix it. Every offer becomes a message, every number becomes symbolic, and every deadline suddenly carries more weight than intended. Which leads to the next uncomfortable reality. If percentages aren't the real problem, then the real issue might be the underlying math itself. Here's the part of this debate that almost nobody wants to say out loud. You can argue about fairness, you can argue about leverage, you can argue about billionaires versus players, but at some point, the conversation runs straight into something far less emotional, physical limitations. Some WNBA franchises simply do not play in massive arenas. Take the Washington Mystics. They play home games at Entertainment and Sports Arena, which holds roughly 4,200 fans. The Atlanta Dream play in Gateway Center Arena, which seats about 3,500. That's not speculation, that's capacity. Now think about what that means financially. Even if every single seat is sold, even if ticket prices are strong, even if demand is peaking, there is a hard ceiling on how much revenue those buildings can physically generate from ticket sales. You cannot sell 10,000 tickets in a 3,500-seat arena. And this is where the tension gets uncomfortable. The union is reportedly pushing for a salary cap in the neighborhood of $9 million per team. But if a franchise's total annual gate revenue from home games struggles to cross a few $1,000,000, ownership will argue that the math simply doesn't stretch that far, especially once you factor in travel, staffing, marketing, arena operations, insurance, and newly expanded charter flight commitments. From ownership's viewpoint, this isn't about refusing to pay players more, it's about scale. They'll argue that the league is growing, yes, but the infrastructure hasn't caught up yet. Bigger contracts require bigger buildings. Bigger buildings require long-term investment. That doesn't happen overnight. But here, the counterpoint players would likely raise. Ticket sales are not the only revenue stream anymore. There are media rights deals, sponsorship agreements, merchandise, national broadcasts, streaming packages. The economic pie is no longer limited to what fits inside an arena. So when ownership leans heavily on seating capacity, some players and supporters push back and say that's an incomplete picture. And that's where the debate becomes layered. Is this a short-term cash flow issue or a long-term valuation argument? Owners may claim they need multiple seasons of sustained growth before dramatically raising payroll commitments. Players may believe that if they wait for perfect stability, the financial upside will already be locked in without them. But the raw math of smaller arenas creates hesitation. It introduces risk, and risk is something billionaires don't ignore, especially in young growth markets. So while the public conversation focuses on percentages and headlines, the real friction might be something far simpler. The buildings aren't big enough yet. And until that changes, every bold demand runs straight into a physical wall. Which raises the next question: if the math is tight and the distrust is deep, what happens when the deadline actually hits? This is where emotion collides with hard reality. The league's biggest markets are booming. Certain games feel electric, but not every franchise operates inside a 15,000-seat arena. The Washington Mystics play in a venue that seats roughly 4,200 fans. The Atlanta Dream host games in a building that holds around 3,500. Those numbers matter more than most fans realize. Even if every single seat is sold for every home game, there is a strict ceiling on ticket revenue. You cannot exceed the physical size of the building. That's not pessimism, that's capacity. Now layer in the union's reported push for a salary cap approaching $9 to $9.5 million per team. Ownership looks at those numbers and immediately does the math. Ticket sales alone in smaller venues may not even cover half of that payroll figure, and that's before factoring in charter flights, coaching staffs, front office salaries, marketing budgets, medical teams, insurance, and arena operations. From the owner's standpoint, this becomes a risk equation. They would argue that growth is real but uneven. Some markets are thriving, others are still stabilizing. A universal high salary cap assumes that every team is generating top-tier revenue. That simply isn't the current landscape. But here, where the tension spikes, players and supporters push back by saying gate revenue is only part of the story. There are national TV deals, corporate partnerships, league-wide sponsorships, shared revenue pools. The money isn't just in the seats anymore, it's in the broadcast rights and brand expansion. So who's right? That depends on how revenue is distributed. If league-wide income is strong, but concentrated in certain markets or centralized media deals, the question becomes how much of that should flow evenly to all teams. And more importantly, how much should be guaranteed to players regardless of individual franchise performance. Owners likely fear locking themselves into contracts that assume today's surge will last forever. One breakout season does not guarantee permanent profitability. They want proof of sustainability. Players, on the other hand, may feel that waiting for multiple safe years of growth only delays fair compensation. Careers are short, windows close quickly. The moment feels historic, and historic moments don't come twice. So now you have two truths existing at the same time. Yes, the league is growing rapidly. And yes, some teams still operate inside buildings that physically limit their earning potential. That contradiction is the pressure point. Because until infrastructure expands, until revenue stabilizes across all markets, every aggressive financial demand will collide with physical limitations, and ownership knows it. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the math doesn't fully support the demand today, what happens when the deadline forces someone to blink? Here's the part of the story that rarely gets full attention. This isn't just about percentages, it's about history. For nearly 3 decades, WNBA ownership groups maintained a consistent message. The league wasn't making money, losses were absorbed, growth was gradual, patience was required. Players were repeatedly told that major salary jumps simply weren't sustainable because profitability wasn't there. Then everything accelerated. When Caitlin Clark entered the league, television ratings spiked dramatically. National broadcasts drew record numbers. Corporate sponsorships expanded. Reports surfaced of a media rights deal valued in the billions. Franchise valuations, according to multiple outlets, jumped sharply in a short period of time. From the players' perspective, the narrative changed overnight. For years, they were told the pie was small. Suddenly, the pie looked massive. And that's where the distrust comes in. Ownership's reported proposal centers around a percentage of net revenue. That means the league calculates total income, subtracts operating expenses, and then shares a portion of what remains. On paper, that sounds reasonable. In practice, it's far more complicated. Players and union representatives have long argued that net can be flexible. Marketing expenses, front office salaries, consulting fees, facility costs, travel investments, all of it gets deducted before profit is calculated. Critics of this structure often refer to it as a form of Hollywood accounting, where a business can technically report minimal profit despite generating significant cash flow. To be clear, there's no verified evidence that the league is engaging in improper accounting, but perception matters in negotiations. And from the union's standpoint, agreeing to a percentage of net revenue can feel like agreeing to a number they can't independently control. That's why the push for a percentage of gross revenue, the top-line figure before deductions, became so central. Gross revenue is cleaner, more transparent, harder to shrink with internal bookkeeping decisions. Ownership, however, sees gross sharing as risky. They argue that gross revenue doesn't account for operational costs, especially in a league still investing heavily in expansion, facilities, marketing, and travel upgrades. Guaranteeing a large cut of gross income, they would say, limits flexibility during growth phases. So now you have two worldviews colliding. Players believe the league's financial explosion justifies a stronger guarantee. Owners believe the growth needs to stabilize before locking in long-term commitments. And layered beneath all of it is something more emotional. Trust. The union likely remembers years of being told the league was struggling. Now, with valuations climbing and national visibility surging, they don't want to miss what could be the most lucrative window in league history. Ownership, meanwhile, may believe they carried financial risk for decades and deserve caution before dramatically shifting the revenue model. Neither side views themselves as unreasonable. But once trust erodes, every proposal feels suspect, every percentage feels strategic, every delay feels intentional. And when negotiation becomes a battle of suspicion instead of collaboration, compromise becomes exponentially harder. Which is exactly why the looming deadline feels less like a formality and more like a pressure trigger waiting to be pulled. Now we get to the tactic that could change everything. If negotiations stay frozen past the March 10 deadline, there's growing discussion about ownership deploying what's known in business circles as an exploding offer. And if that happens, the pressure instantly shifts. Here and how it works. Instead of simply pulling the current proposal off the table, ownership would reportedly reduce it piece by piece. Every single day it goes unsigned. One day the revenue share drops. The next day certain guarantees shrink. Then housing stipends disappear. Minimum salaries adjust downward. The longer the union waits, the worse the deal becomes. It's not just a deadline, it's a countdown. This strategy isn't random, it's psychological. In high-stakes labor disputes, time can either be neutral or it can be weaponized. An exploding offer turns the calendar into a threat. Every sunrise represents lost income. Every delay costs real money. And here, why that matters. A significant portion of the league is either in free agency or on short-term contracts. Not every player has major endorsement deals or overseas fallback options. For many, The upcoming season represents their primary source of income. If uncertainty drags on, financial anxiety grows quickly. Ownership, by contrast, is structurally insulated. Team owners are typically billionaires or backed by ownership groups with diversified assets. They can absorb a cancelled season as a long-term tax write-off. They can afford patience. Players, especially those without max contracts, often cannot. That imbalance is what makes the exploding offer so powerful. It doesn't attack the union publicly. It doesn't escalate rhetoric. It simply tightens the financial clock. Rank-and-file players may begin pressuring union leadership internally. Calls and messages start flooding in. Questions get louder. Why are we risking guaranteed money? What if this deal gets worse tomorrow? Solidarity becomes harder to maintain. Of course, there's risk on the ownership side too. If the tactic is perceived as overly aggressive, it could damage public perception. Fans might sympathize with players. Media narratives could shift toward framing the move as heavy-handed or punitive. But in pure leverage terms, it's effective. Because it doesn't require compromise, it forces urgency. Now here's the twist. There's no official confirmation that ownership will deploy this strategy. It's been discussed by analysts and former executives, and it fits common corporate negotiation playbooks. But until the deadline passes, it remains theoretical. Still, the mere possibility changes behavior. When both sides know that the offer might deteriorate after a certain date, the negotiation atmosphere shifts. Caution increases, internal divisions widen, the fear of missing out becomes tangible. And that's what makes March 10 feel less like a meeting and more like a trigger. If the offer explodes, the pressure won't be public first. It will be internal. And once that internal pressure builds, the balance of power could tilt very quickly. Here's the part most fans won't see on social media. If the deadline passes and the offer starts shrinking, the real battle won't be between owners and the union in public. It'll be inside the locker rooms. Because not every player is in the same financial position. Superstars with endorsement deals, signature shoes, and national visibility can afford to wait. They have leverage beyond the league, but the majority of players don't. Many rely almost entirely on their WNBA contracts. Some supplement income overseas. Others depend on guaranteed salary to support families, cover training costs, and secure long-term stability. If an exploding offer becomes reality, every single day costs them money. That's when tension builds. Union leadership may believe they're fighting for the long-term future of the league, pushing for structural change that benefits generations to come. But the rank and file might start thinking short-term survival. If the revenue share drops from 15% to 14%, or certain benefits disappear, that isn't abstract. That's rent, that's savings, that's security. And once individual anxiety creeps in, solidarity gets tested. Historically, labor movements survive on unity. The moment members begin questioning strategy, cracks form quickly. It doesn't require public arguments. It starts with private calls, text messages, closed-door meetings. Are we sure this is worth it? What if the deal keeps getting worse? What if we're overplaying our hand? Union executives are then trapped between two pressures: holding firm to maintain negotiating credibility or signing a deal to prevent further erosion. Ownership understands this dynamic. They don't need to attack publicly, they simply need patience. Time becomes the wedge. As uncertainty drags on, the emotional weight shifts from bold demands to risk avoidance. And here's the uncomfortable reality: the longer negotiations stall, the more difficult it becomes for union leadership to maintain a unified front, especially if a large percentage of the league is entering free agency and needs clarity. But there's also risk on the player side. If leadership caves too quickly, they could lose credibility with members who believe this is a historic leverage moment. If they hold out too long, they risk internal backlash for costing players tangible income. It's a narrow path. This isn't just a financial chess match, it's a psychological endurance test. Who feels the pressure first, who absorbs uncertainty better, who fractures internally. Because once unity weakens, leverage disappears fast. And if internal division reaches a tipping point, the negotiation doesn't end with a dramatic press conference. It ends quietly, with signatures driven less by agreement and more by exhaustion. Here's the deeper question hiding underneath all the percentages. Is this moment about securing long-term growth or cashing in on a sudden surge? For nearly 30 years, the WNBA operated as a slow-burn project. Investment outweighed returns, owners absorbed losses, expansion was cautious, visibility grew gradually, then in what felt like a single season, everything accelerated, ratings climbed, sponsorship deals expanded, media rights discussions reportedly jumped into billion-dollar territory, franchise valuations skyrocketed. And when that kind of spike happens, it creates urgency. From the player's perspective, this isn't random timing. This is the breakthrough they've been promised for decades. They've carried the league through lean years. They've marketed the product. They've built loyal fan bases. So when the financial tide finally turns, they want guarantees, not future promises. Because here's the reality: careers are short. Veteran players understand that by the time long-term sustainability is fully proven, they may no longer be in the league. Waiting 5 years for stability might mean missing the peak revenue window entirely. So pushing aggressively now feels justified. If the league is truly entering a golden era, why shouldn't they claim a meaningful share immediately? But ownership sees the timeline differently. One explosive season does not equal permanent transformation. They may argue that sustainable growth requires multiple years of consistent ratings, consistent attendance, and consistent sponsorship renewal. A rookie-driven surge, even one as powerful as the buzz around Caitlin Clark, doesn't automatically guarantee stability. In traditional business strategy, when a company finally turns profitable after years of losses, leadership typically reinvests rather than dramatically increasing fixed costs. They strengthen infrastructure, expand marketing, secure long-term contracts, protect cash flow. Only after stability is confirmed do they significantly raise baseline expenses. So from that angle, locking in a dramatically higher revenue share too quickly could feel risky. This is the fundamental clash. Players view this as overdue compensation for decades of patience. Owners view it as a fragile growth phase that needs protection. Neither side is necessarily irrational. But timing is everything. If players push too hard and the surge cools off next season, critics will say they overplayed their hand. If ownership suppresses compensation during a historic boom, resentment deepens and trust erodes further. And here's the hidden danger. If negotiations collapse and a season is shortened or cancelled, the momentum itself could fade. Fans have short attention spans. Media cycles move quickly. A stalled season risks cooling off the very growth everyone is fighting over. So the real gamble isn't just about percentages. It's about whether this moment is the beginning of a sustained era or a spike that still needs proof. Push too early and you risk destabilizing the foundation. Wait too long and you risk missing the wave. That's the tightrope both sides are walking, and the next move could define the league's trajectory for the next decade. So now we arrive at the question that matters more than any percentage on paper. Who actually holds the leverage? On the surface, it looks like the players seized momentum. The league is more visible than ever. Television ratings surged. Social media engagement exploded. Star power reached new heights. For the first time in years, the WNBA isn't fighting for attention, it's commanding it. That shift feels powerful. But leverage isn't just about momentum, it's about durability. Ownership groups can survive a stalled season. They have diversified assets. They can write off short-term losses. They can afford to wait. Players, especially those without major endorsement deals, operate on a different clock. Careers are short, contracts are limited, income windows are narrow. That difference changes everything. The union's argument rests on timing. This is the moment. Growth is real, valuations are rising, media deals are expanding. If they don't push now, when will they? From their perspective, settling too early locks in a structure that undervalues the players during a historic upswing. Ownership's counterargument rests on sustainability. One explosive cycle doesn't guarantee permanent transformation. Long-term stability requires patience. Committing to aggressive revenue sharing too early could strain franchises that are still stabilizing. So the leverage battle becomes psychological. If the players remain unified, ownership faces pressure to avoid public fallout and protect league momentum. If the owners implement a hard deadline or even an exploding offer strategy, the pressure shifts internally to the players. And here's the twist. Leverage can change overnight. If the deadline passes and unity fractures, ownership regains control. If public sentiment turns sharply in favor of the players, ownership risks reputational damage that could cost more than financial concessions. In reality, both sides are playing high-stakes chess. The union gambled on a breakthrough moment. Ownership is betting on patience and structural advantage. One side is fueled by urgency, the other is anchored in long-term capital strength. March 10 isn't just a date, it's a test of endurance. Will the players' solidarity outlast financial pressure? Will ownership blink to protect the league's momentum? Or will both sides push so hard that the very growth they're fighting over starts to cool? This isn't just a labor dispute. It's a defining crossroads for the future of the league. And whichever side miscalculates won't just lose a negotiation. They could reshape the trajectory of the WNBA for the next decade.